The ship was quiet. Too quiet. Danny Cole had never heard the Resolute this silent before. For 3 years he had worked on this vessel, and there had always been noise. Footsteps in the corridors, voices in the mess hall, the hum of machines and the beeping of computers. But now there was nothing, just the soft breathing of the ship itself, the distant rumble of engines keeping them floating in the black emptiness of space. Danny sat on the edge of his bed in his small room and looked at his bandaged arm. A stupid accident. A falling pipe in the engine room had caught him across the forearm 2 days ago. The medical officer had told him to rest. No heavy work for at least a week. So when the distress call came in from the Velthari cruiser and Captain Laura Bennett ordered the crew to prepare for a rescue mission, Danny was told to stay behind. He had argued. He had said he could still help. But the captain had looked at him with those calm brown eyes and told him that the ship needed someone to watch over it. The Resolute was old and tired. Someone had to stay and keep an eye on things. Someone had to finish the repairs on the ventilation system in the lower decks. So Danny stayed. He watched from the observation window as the shuttle pods launched one after another, carrying the crew of 47 toward the distant Velthari ship. He watched until the pods became small dots of light, and then until they disappeared completely into the darkness. Then he was alone. The Resolute was a human exploration vessel, one of the oldest still in service. It had been built more than 60 years ago, back during a time that Danny had only read about in history files. The ship had seen wars and peace. It had carried thousands of crew members across millions of miles of space. Now it floated at the edge of known territory, a place where human ships rarely traveled, doing survey work that nobody else wanted to do. Danny walked through the empty corridors and listened to his own footsteps echo off the metal walls. He passed the mess hall where just hours ago he had eaten breakfast with his friends. The tables were clean now. The chairs were empty. He passed the medical bay where Dr. Amy Lynn had wrapped his arm and told him to take it easy. The lights were dim in there, set to standby mode. He made his way down to the lower maintenance decks. This was where the real work needed to be done. The ventilation system had been acting up for weeks. The air filters were clogged with dust and debris. It was a simple job, but someone had to do it, and that someone was now Danny. The lower decks were different from the rest of the ship. They were older, darker, and more cramped. The corridors were narrow and the ceilings were low. Pipes and cables ran along the walls like veins. The lights flickered sometimes, and there were sounds that Danny could not explain. Creaks and groans that seemed to come from the ship itself, as if the Resolute was an old man complaining about his aching bones. Danny found the access shaft that led to the ventilation system and began to crawl inside. He had a flashlight in one hand and a tool bag hanging from his belt. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to move slowly to avoid hitting his injured arm against the walls. He worked for about an hour, replacing filters and cleaning out dust from the vents. It was boring work, but it kept his mind busy. He tried not to think about the empty ship above him. He tried not to think about how strange it felt to be completely alone in the middle of space. Then his flashlight caught something odd. There was a panel in the wall of the shaft, hidden behind a thick bundle of cables and pipes. Danny had crawled through this shaft before many times, but he had never noticed this panel. It was small, maybe 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall, and it was slightly open, just a crack, but enough for Danny to see that there was darkness behind it. He stopped moving and stared at the panel. His heart beat a little faster. This was not supposed to be here. He knew every inch of these maintenance shafts. He had studied the ship's blueprints when he first came aboard. There was no panel here on any of the official maps. Danny reached out and pushed the cables aside. They were stiff and covered with dust. Nobody had touched them in a very long time. He grabbed the edge of the panel and pulled. It resisted at first, stuck from years of neglect. But then it came loose with a grinding sound that made Danny wince. Behind the panel was a small compartment, just big enough for a person to fit their upper body inside. Danny shined his flashlight into the darkness and saw something that made him hold his breath. There was a button, a single red button, sitting beneath a glass cover on a small metal platform. The button was old. The red paint was faded and chipped. The glass cover was scratched and cloudy. There were no labels anywhere, no instructions, no warnings. Just a button, hidden away in the guts of the ship, where nobody would ever find it. Danny stared at the button for a long time. He did not touch it. He did not even move closer. He just looked at it and wondered what it was and why it was here and who had put it here. He pulled himself out of the access shaft and sat on the cold floor of the maintenance deck. His hands were shaking a little. He told himself it was nothing, just an old piece of equipment that someone had forgotten about. Maybe it did not even work anymore. Maybe it was just a leftover from some ancient system that had been replaced decades ago. But something told him that was not true. Something told him that this button was important. The way it was hidden. The way it was protected behind that glass cover. The way it seemed to be waiting for someone to find it. This was not just forgotten equipment. This was something else. Danny went to the nearest computer terminal and asked the ship's computer about the compartment he had found. The computer had no information. There was no record of any hidden panel or any button in that location. According to the official files, that section of the shaft was supposed to be solid wall. He asked the computer about the history of the ship. The Resolute had been in service for 62 years. It had been repaired and upgraded many times. But the computer had no information about anything called Protocol Omega or any secret systems from the original construction. Danny sat in the empty corridor and thought about what to do. He could report his finding to Captain Bennett when she returned. He could wait and forget about it and go back to his normal work. But the image of that red button stayed in his mind. It glowed behind his eyes every time he closed them. He knew he should leave it alone. He knew he should wait for the captain. But Danny Cole had always been curious. It was what made him a good engineer. He could not look at a problem and walk away. He had to understand it. He had to know how things worked. He went back to the computer terminal and started digging deeper into the archives. Somewhere in the old files, buried under years of updates and rewrites, there had to be answers. And Danny was going to find them. The empty ship hummed around him, keeping its secrets close. But secrets have a way of coming out. And this one had been waiting for 60 years. Danny spent the next 6 hours searching through the ship's computer archives. He forgot about his injured arm. He forgot about the ventilation repairs. He forgot about everything except the red button hidden in the walls of the Resolute. The ship's main database had nothing useful. Every search came back empty. But Danny was an engineer, and he knew that computers never truly forget anything. Data could be hidden, locked away, or buried under layers of newer information, but it was always there somewhere. You just had to know where to look. He found what he was looking for in a section of the archive that was marked as corrupted. Most crew members would have ignored it. The files were damaged and hard to read. But Danny was patient. He spent hours piecing together fragments of text, rebuilding broken data files, and following digital trails that had been cold for decades. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the ship he called home. The Resolute had not always been called the Resolute. 62 years ago, when it was first built, the ship had a different name. It was called the Defiant, and it was not built for exploration. It was built for war. Danny leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. The words glowed in front of him, telling a story that had been erased from official history. The Defiant was constructed during the darkest period of human space travel, a time known as the First Contact War. It was the first and only war between humans and an alien species called the Corvani Collective. Danny had learned about the Corvani in school. Everyone had. They were taught that the Corvani were a powerful species that lived on the other side of the galaxy. There had been a brief conflict 60 years ago, a misunderstanding that led to fighting, but peace was made, and the two species agreed to stay away from each other. The Corvani kept to their space, and humans kept to theirs. It was a simple story, a clean story. But the files Danny found told a different version. The war had not been brief. It had lasted almost 5 years. The Corvani had attacked human colonies without warning, destroying entire worlds in a matter of hours. Their technology was far beyond anything humans had at the time. Their ships were faster, their weapons were stronger, and their tactics were brutal. For the first 3 years of the war, humanity was losing. Danny read about battles where human fleets were wiped out completely, He read about colonies that sent distress signals and then went silent forever. He read about the fear that spread through human space, the belief that this was the end, that humanity would be erased from the universe before they had even begun to explore it. And then he read about the Defiant. The ship was built in secret at a hidden shipyard. It was designed by the best engineers humanity had, people who knew they were building something that might never be used, but something that had to exist just in case. The Defiant was not meant to fight the Corvani directly. It was meant to carry a weapon of last resort. The weapon was called Protocol Omega. Danny's hands trembled as he read the technical specifications. Protocol Omega was not a bomb or a missile. It was a signal. The Corvani relied on networked technology. Their ships, their weapons, their communication systems, everything was connected through a vast digital web that spanned their entire civilization. Protocol Omega was designed to attack that web. It would send out a signal that would spread through the Corvani network like a disease, corrupting their systems and shutting down their technology. The button Danny had found was the trigger. Press it, and the signal would launch. The Corvani fleet would go dark. Their weapons would fail. Their ships would become floating tombs. But there was a cost. The signal could not be hidden. The moment it was activated, the Corvani would know exactly where it came from. They would trace it back to the source in seconds. The ship that pressed the button would be targeted by every Corvani weapon within range. There would be no time to escape, no chance of survival. Protocol Omega was a suicide mission. Danny sat in the dark computer room and tried to understand what he was reading. The engineers who built this weapon knew that whoever activated it would die. They built it anyway. They installed it on the Defiant and waited for the order that they hoped would never come. The order never came. In the final year of the war, something changed. The Corvani suddenly stopped attacking. They pulled their fleets back to their own territory and sent a message offering peace. Humanity accepted. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a quiet agreement. The Corvani would stay on their side of the galaxy. Humans would stay on theirs. And both species would try to forget that the war had ever happened. The Defiant was never used. Protocol Omega was never activated. The ship was taken apart and rebuilt. Its weapons were removed. Its name was changed. It became the Resolute, an exploration vessel, and the button was sealed away in the walls where nobody would ever find it. Until now. Danny understood why the history had been erased. The war was a shameful memory. Humanity had almost been destroyed. They had been so desperate that they had built a weapon that required someone to die to use it. That was not the kind of story people wanted to tell their children. It was easier to pretend it had been a small conflict, a misunderstanding, something that was quickly resolved. But the button was still there, hidden in the ship, waiting in the darkness, ready to do what it was built to do. Danny thought about telling Captain Bennett. He thought about calling the crew and sharing what he had found. But something stopped him. The Corvani had been silent for 60 years. They had kept their promise. There was no war now, no threat, no danger. What good would it do to dig up old secrets? He decided to wait until the crew returned. He would talk to the captain privately and show her what he had found. She would know what to do. She always knew what to do. Danny saved the files he had found to a personal data chip and put it in his pocket. Then he turned off the computer and sat in the darkness for a long time. He thought about the engineers who had built the button. He wondered what it must have been like to create something so terrible, something that could only be used by dying. He wondered if any of them had ever stood where he was standing now, looking at that red button and thinking about what it meant. He went back to the maintenance shaft one more time. He crawled through the narrow passage until he reached the hidden panel. He shined his flashlight on the button and looked at it. The glass cover was dusty. The red paint was faded. But the button itself looked ready. It looked like it was waiting. Danny reached out and touched the glass cover. It was cold under his fingers. He did not lift it. He did not touch the button. He just felt the glass and thought about all the history sealed inside. Then he heard the communication system crackle to life. Captain Bennett's voice filled the ship, distant and tired. "Resolute, this is Captain Bennett. We are returning. Prepare for docking. We have news. Bad news. Danny pulled his hand away from the glass and crawled back out of the shaft. The crew was coming home, and from the sound of the captain's voice, the 60 years of silence were about to end. The shuttle pods docked one after another, filling the Resolute with the sound of footsteps and voices again. But these were not the happy sounds that Danny was used to. There was no laughter in the corridors, no friendly greetings in the mess hall. The crew walked with their heads down and their faces pale. Something terrible had happened. Danny stood near the main docking bay and watched as the crew members filed past him. Some of them looked at him with empty eyes. Others did not look at him at all. He saw his friend Kevin Park, a young lieutenant who usually had a smile for everyone. Kevin's face was like stone. He walked past Danny without saying a word. Then Captain Laura Bennett appeared. She was a tall woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. She had been captain of the Resolute for 12 years, and Danny had never seen her look afraid. But she looked afraid now. There was something in her eyes that made Danny's stomach turn cold. The captain gathered everyone in the main meeting room. It was the largest space on the ship, but it still felt crowded with all 47 crew members packed inside. Danny stood in the back corner and waited for someone to explain what was happening. Captain Bennett stood at the front of the room and looked at her crew. She was silent for a long moment, as if she was trying to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. "The Velthari cruiser was attacked," she said. "Not by pirates, not by an accident. They were attacked by Corvani warships." The room went silent. Danny felt his heart stop beating for a moment. The Corvani. The same species he had just been reading about. The same species that had almost destroyed humanity 60 years ago. "That is not possible," someone said from the front of the room. It was Commander Greg Santos, an older man who had served in space for over 40 years. "The Corvani have been silent for 6 decades. They do not come to this part of the galaxy." "They do now," the captain replied. "We saw them with our own eyes. 3 Corvani warships. They destroyed the Velthari cruiser before we could reach it. We barely escaped." The room erupted in questions and frightened voices. Danny stood frozen in the corner, his hand moving unconsciously to his pocket where the data chip with the old files was stored. The button, the hidden weapon. It suddenly felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Captain Bennett raised her hand and the room went quiet again. "There is more," she said. "While we were returning, we tried to contact Earth. We tried to contact the nearest human colonies. We tried to contact anyone." She paused and took a deep breath. "All communications are down. We cannot reach anyone." The silence that followed was the heaviest Danny had ever felt. No communications meant they were alone. It meant they had no way of knowing what was happening in the rest of human space. It meant they had no way of calling for help. Over the next 2 days, the situation became clearer and more terrifying. The Resolute's long-range sensors picked up transmissions from across the sector. Most of them were distress signals, human ships calling for help, colony worlds reporting attacks, military vessels screaming about enemy contacts before going silent. The Corvani had returned, and they were not just attacking one ship or one colony. They were attacking everywhere. Danny spent those 2 days in a state of shock. He went through the motions of his work, helping with repairs and monitoring systems, but his mind was far away. He kept thinking about the files he had found. He kept thinking about Protocol Omega. He kept thinking about the button hidden in the walls of the ship. He wanted to tell someone. He needed to tell someone. But every time he tried to approach Captain Bennett, she was surrounded by other officers, making plans, receiving reports, trying to hold the crew together. There was never a right moment. On the 3rd day, the Resolute received a direct transmission. It was from a human military command station that was still operating. The message was short and terrible. 3 colony worlds had fallen. Earth was under attack. The Corvani fleet was larger than anything humanity had ever seen. And worst of all, the enemy ships were using some kind of new shield technology that made them almost impossible to destroy. Human weapons were barely scratching them. The crew gathered in the meeting room again. This time there were tears on many faces. Some people held hands. Others stared at nothing. They were watching their species die. Captain Bennett stood at the front again. She looked older than she had 3 days ago. "We have been ordered to join a defensive line near the colony world of New Cascadia," she said. "There is a fleet gathering there. It may be our last chance to stop the Corvani advance." Danny listened to the captain explain the situation. The fleet at New Cascadia was made up of whatever ships could get there in time. Old vessels, civilian transports, cargo haulers, anything that could carry a weapon. The Resolute was being called to fight, even though it was an exploration ship with minimal weapons. After the meeting, Danny finally found his moment. He waited until the room emptied and approached the captain. His hands were shaking as he pulled the data chip from his pocket. "Captain," he said, "I need to show you something." Laura Bennett looked at him with tired eyes. "What is it, Danny?" "I found something. While I was alone on the ship, something hidden in the walls." He held out the data chip. "Something from the war, the first war. It might be able to help us." The captain took the chip and looked at it. Her expression did not change, but Danny saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or fear. "Come with me," she said, "and do not speak of this to anyone. Not yet." She led him to her private office and locked the door behind them. Then she put the chip into her computer and began to read. Danny watched her face as the words scrolled across the screen. He watched her learn the same terrible truth that he had learned. When she finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she looked at Danny with an expression he could not read. "You found the button," she said. It was not a question. Danny nodded. "Yes." "Did you touch it?" "No, I only looked at it." The captain leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "I knew this ship had secrets," she said quietly. "Every old ship does, but I never imagined something like this." "It might still work," Danny said. "The Corvani still use networked systems. Everyone knows that. If we activate Protocol Omega, we could shut down their entire fleet." "And kill everyone on this ship," the captain replied. "Including you, including me, including every person who trusted me to keep them safe." "I know." Danny's voice was barely a whisper. "But if we do nothing, everyone dies anyway. Not just us. Everyone." Captain Bennett opened her eyes and looked at him. For a moment, Danny saw the weight of 60 years of hidden history pressing down on her shoulders. She was the captain of a ship that was built to die, and now she had to decide whether to let it fulfill its purpose. "I need to think about this," she said. "And I need to talk to the crew. All of them. They deserve to know what we are carrying." She stood up and put her hand on Danny's shoulder. "You did the right thing by telling me. Whatever happens next, remember that. You did the right thing." Danny nodded, but he did not feel like he had done anything right. He felt like he had opened a door that should have stayed closed, and now everyone would have to walk through it together. The Resolute reached New Cascadia 4 days later. What Danny saw through the observation window made his heart sink. The defensive fleet was smaller than he had expected. There were maybe 50 ships in total, and most of them looked as old and tired as the Resolute. These were not warships. They were cargo vessels and transport ships and research stations that had been hastily armed with whatever weapons could be found. This was humanity's last line of defense, and it looked like a collection of floating junk. The Corvani fleet appeared on the sensors 12 hours after the Resolute took its position. Danny was on the bridge when the first contact report came through. The numbers were impossible to believe. Over 200 enemy ships, all of them larger and more powerful than anything in the human fleet. They moved through space like a dark cloud, blocking out the stars as they approached. Captain Bennett ordered the crew to battle stations. Danny went to his post in the engine room, where he would monitor the ship's power systems during the fight. He worked alongside 3 other engineers, all of them trying to keep their hands steady as the enemy drew closer. The battle began at noon, ship time. Danny did not see the fighting directly. He was deep in the belly of the Resolute, watching numbers and graphs on his screens, listening to the sounds of the ship shaking around him. But he heard the reports that came over the communication system. He heard the voices of other crews as they fought and died. The human weapons were useless. The Corvani shields absorbed everything that was thrown at them. Missiles exploded against invisible walls and did nothing. Energy beams scattered like light through glass. Ship after ship was destroyed, while the enemy fleet kept advancing without slowing down. Danny listened to the death screams of 100 crews. He listened to captains give their final orders. He listened to friends say goodbye to each other across the void of space. And through it all, he thought about the button. The red button hidden in the walls of the ship. The weapon that could end this war but would also end his life. After 6 hours, the battle was over. The human fleet had lost 30 ships. The Corvani had lost none. The survivors retreated, scattering in different directions, hoping that some of them might escape. The Resolute was one of the lucky ones. Its engines were still working, and Captain Bennett ordered a full retreat. That night, the captain called another meeting. But this time, it was not in the main room with all the crew. It was in her private office with only the senior officers present. Danny was surprised when he received the order to attend. He was just an engineer, the youngest one on the ship. But he understood why he was there. He was the one who had found the button. The room was small and crowded with bodies. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk. Commander Santos stood against the wall with his arms crossed. Lieutenant Park was there, along with Dr. Lin and the Chief of Security, a woman named Karen Price. Danny stood in the corner and tried to make himself invisible. "You all know why we are here," the captain began. "Danny has found something. Something that was hidden on this ship for 60 years. Something that might be able to stop the Corvani." She explained Protocol Omega to the officers. She told them about the button, about the signal, about the cost. When she finished, the room was silent. Commander Santos was the first to speak. He was an old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. He had served in space since before most of them were born. "I remember the first war," he said quietly. "I was just a boy, but I remember the fear. I remember thinking that we were all going to die. And then the war ended, and I thought we were safe." He shook his head. "We were never safe. We just forgot to be afraid." "The signal might not even work," Dr. Lin said. She was a small woman with kind eyes, but her voice was sharp. "It was designed 60 years ago. The Corvani technology has changed since then. We could sacrifice ourselves for nothing." "Or we could save everyone," Lieutenant Park replied. His face was hard. He had lost friends in the battle. Danny could see the anger in his eyes. "If there is even a chance that this works, do we not have to try?" Karen Price shook her head. "We cannot make this decision for the crew. They did not sign up to die. They signed up to explore space and fix broken equipment and eat bad food in the mess hall. This is not their fight." "It is now," the captain said. "It is everyone's fight. The Corvani are not going to stop. You saw what happened out there. Our weapons are useless against them. They will destroy every colony, every station, every ship. They will wipe humanity from the universe unless someone stops them." The debate went on for hours. Danny listened without speaking. He watched the officers argue about duty and sacrifice and the value of human life. He watched them struggle with a question that had no good answer. Finally, Captain Bennett held up her hand and the room went quiet. "I have made a decision," she said. "We will tell the crew everything, all of it, the history, the weapon, the cost, and then we will vote. Every single person on this ship will have a voice. If even one person votes against it, we will find another way. This will not be a death sentence that I order. It will be a choice that we make together." The next morning, the entire crew gathered in the main meeting room. Captain Bennett stood at the front and told them the truth. She told them about the Defiant and the First War. She told them about Protocol Omega. She told them about the button that Danny had found hidden in the walls. And then she asked them to vote. The voting took place in private. Each crew member went to a computer terminal and entered their choice. Yes or no. Live or die. Danny stood in line with everyone else and waited for his turn. When he reached the terminal, his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely touch the screen. He thought about his family back on Earth. He thought about the colonies full of children who would never grow up if the Corvani won. He thought about all the people who had already died in this war and all the people who would die if nobody did anything to stop it. He pressed yes. When all the votes were counted, Captain Bennett read the results to the crew. Her voice was steady, but Danny could see tears in her eyes. 47 votes cast, she said. 47 yes, 0 no. The decision is unanimous. The room was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They had all just voted to die, and the weight of that choice hung over them like a shadow. Then Captain Bennett looked directly at Danny. "You found the button," she said. "You discovered this weapon. I think it is only right that you be the one to activate it." Danny felt the blood drain from his face. He had expected to die with the rest of the crew. He had not expected to be the one who actually pressed the button. But he understood why the captain had chosen him. He was the one who had started this. He should be the one to finish it. "I will do it," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant and calm. The captain nodded. "Then we have work to do. We need to get close to the Corvani fleet, close enough for the signal to reach their command ships. It will be the most dangerous flight any of us has ever made." She looked around the room at her crew. At the 47 people who had chosen to sacrifice themselves for a species that would never know their names. "I am proud of all of you," she said. "Whatever happens next, remember that. You are the bravest people I have ever known." The crew dispersed to their stations. The Resolute turned and began its final journey toward the enemy fleet. And Danny Cole walked slowly down to the lower maintenance decks, to the hidden panel in the wall, to the red button that was waiting for him. The button that no one had been willing to press for 60 years. Until now. The Resolute moved through space like a ghost. All unnecessary systems had been shut down to reduce their signal. The lights in the corridors were dim. The engines ran at minimum power. The ship was trying to get as close to the Corvani fleet as possible before being detected. Danny sat in the narrow maintenance shaft, his back against the cold metal wall, staring at the hidden compartment that held the button. He had opened the panel completely now. The glass cover over the red button reflected the weak light from his flashlight. It looked so simple. Just a button. Just a piece of old technology. But it held the power to change everything. He thought about the engineers who had built this weapon 60 years ago. They had known that someone would have to die to use it. They had built it anyway, because they believed that some things were worth dying for. Danny wondered if they had ever imagined someone like him sitting here. A young engineer from a small town on Earth, alone in the dark, holding the fate of his species in his hands. The ship's communication system crackled. Captain Bennett's voice filled the corridor. "All hands, this is the captain. We are approaching the Corvani fleet. Estimated time to engagement range is 15 minutes. This may be the last time I speak to you. I want you to know that serving with you has been the greatest honor of my life. Whatever happens in the next hour, know that humanity will remember what we did here today. Even if no one survives to tell the story, the universe will know that humans do not give up. We fight until the end. Bennett out." Danny closed his eyes and took a deep breath. 15 minutes. 15 minutes until he would press the button and everything would change. Or everything would end. He was not sure which. The minutes passed slowly. Danny listened to the sounds of the ship, the hum of the engines, the distant voices of crew members at their stations, the creaking of old metal as the Resolute pushed forward. These were the sounds of his life, the sounds of his home. Soon they would be gone. The ship shook as the first Corvani weapons hit. The battle had begun. Danny grabbed the sides of the shaft to steady himself. Alarms began to sound throughout the ship. Red lights flashed in the corridors. The captain's voice came over the speakers again, calm and controlled even as the ship was being torn apart. "All hands, we are under fire. Stay at your stations. Danny, we are in range. Whenever you are ready." Danny looked at the button. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it in his ears. This was the moment. This was what everything had been leading to. He reached out and lifted the glass cover. It swung up easily on old hinges, revealing the button beneath. The red paint was faded and chipped, but the button itself looked solid. Ready. Waiting. The ship shook again, harder this time. Danny heard the sound of metal tearing somewhere above him. They did not have much time. He placed his finger on the button. It was cold to the touch. 60 years of waiting. and now it was finally going to serve its purpose. Danny thought about his mother. She was probably at home right now, watching the news, worrying about him. He thought about his father, who had always told him to be brave, to do the right thing even when it was hard. He thought about his little sister, who wanted to be an engineer just like him. He thought about all the people on all the colonies who were waiting for someone to save them. Children who would grow up. Families who would stay together. A future that would exist because someone had the courage to press a button. "I am sorry," he whispered to no one. "I am sorry, I will not see you again." And then he pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. The ship continued to shake. The alarms continued to sound. Danny wondered if the weapon had failed. 60 years was a long time. Maybe the signal generator was broken. Maybe this had all been for nothing. Then his screen lit up with data. The signal was transmitting. It was spreading outward from the Resolute in an invisible wave, reaching out across space toward the Corvani fleet. Danny watched the numbers scroll across the display. The signal was strong. It was working. The ship's sensors detected the first failures in the enemy fleet. One Corvani ship lost power, then another. Then 10 more, then 100. The signal was spreading through their network like fire through dry grass. Systems were shutting down. Weapons were going offline. Engines were failing. The Corvani ships began to drift. They were no longer attacking. They were no longer doing anything. They were just floating in space, dark and silent, their great networked mind screaming in digital agony as it tore itself apart. Danny watched in amazement as the entire enemy fleet went dark. 200 ships, each one larger than the Resolute, and now they were nothing but floating metal. The signal had worked. Protocol Omega had done what it was designed to do. But they were not safe yet. The old engineers had said that the ship would be targeted instantly. They had said there would be no time to escape. Danny waited for the end. He waited for the Corvani weapons to find them. The seconds passed. 10, 20, 30. Nothing happened. The captain's voice came over the speakers, filled with disbelief. "Danny, what is happening? The Corvani ships are all dark. They are not firing. They are not moving. What did you do?" Danny looked at his screen and tried to understand. The signal had spread faster than anyone expected. The Corvani systems had failed before they could lock weapons on the Resolute. The enemy ships had lost power before they could fire a single shot. They were alive. Against all odds, against everything the old engineers had predicted, they were alive. Danny climbed out of the maintenance shaft on shaking legs. He walked through the corridors of the ship, past crew members who were staring at their screens in shock, past engineers who were checking systems they thought would never work again. He walked to the bridge, where Captain Bennett was standing in front of the main display, watching the Corvani fleet drift helplessly in space. She turned when she heard him enter. There were tears on her face. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." Danny could not speak. He could not find the words. He just stood there, looking at the screen, looking at the 200 dead ships, looking at the proof that one person with enough courage could change the universe. The Allied fleet arrived 6 hours later. They found the Resolute floating among the silent Corvani vessels, battered and damaged but still alive. They found 47 crew members who had voted to die and had somehow survived. They found Danny Cole, still standing on the bridge, still not quite believing what he had done. In the months that followed, the story of the Resolute spread across human space. The war ended not with more fighting, but with the complete collapse of the Corvani network. Their civilization, so dependent on their connected technology, fell apart when that technology was destroyed. They sued for peace and retreated to their own territory, broken and defeated. Danny became famous. People called him a hero. They said he was the man who saved humanity, the man who pressed the button that no one else would press. There were parades and ceremonies and medals. His face was on every news screen in human space. But Danny never felt like a hero. He felt like an engineer who had found something broken and decided to fix it. He felt like someone who had been in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge and the right amount of courage to do what needed to be done. He returned to the Resolute after all the celebrations were over. The ship had been repaired and upgraded, but the hidden compartment was still there. The button was still there, though it no longer worked. Someone had suggested removing it, but Danny had asked them to leave it. It was a reminder. A reminder of what fear could drive people to build. A reminder of what courage could drive people to do. He stood in the maintenance shaft one last time and looked at the faded red button. He thought about all the people who had known about it over the past 60 years. All the captains and admirals and engineers who had chosen not to press it, who had hoped there would always be another way. They had been right to wait. Because in the end, the button had not been a weapon of destruction. It had been a weapon of hope. It had been proof that humans would never give up, no matter how dark things got. It had been a promise that there would always be someone brave enough to do the impossible. Danny Cole reached out and touched the button one last time. Then he closed the panel, sealed it shut, and walked away. The war was over. The future was safe. And somewhere in the universe, the spirit of those desperate engineers from 60 years ago was finally at peace. Their weapon had served its purpose, and their faith in humanity had been rewarded.